True power does not need to announce itself. True power sits in the absolute stillness, waiting patiently for the noise of arrogance to exhaust its own breath. The plastic edges of the handcuffs would eventually bite into flesh. The blood would eventually taste of warm copper against a bruised lip, and the digital lenses of 100 smartphones would capture every humiliating second. But long before the physical violence erupted in the narrow, pressurized aisle of Horizon Airlines Flight 402, the injustice began the way it always did. Not with a shout, but with a whisper. Not with a weapon, but with a policy. The dawn air over New York City carried the bitter, metallic chill of early November. Cutting through the heavy exhaust fumes idling outside John F. Kennedy International Airport, Isaiah Washington stepped out of the black town car, his leather duffel bag slung effortlessly over one broad shoulder. To the untrained eye of the curbside skycaps and rushing commuters, the man blending into the morning chaos was nobody of consequence. The faded charcoal hoodie looked like standard weekend gym apparel. The dark denim appeared unbranded, worn at the edges. The sneakers lacked the flashing, recognizable logos of modern hype culture. But the hoodie was spun from pure vicuña and cashmere by Loro Piana. The denim was custom loomed in kurashiki, and the unbranded sneakers were bespoke leather, shaped by a master cobbler in Milan. It was millions of dollars wrapped in the perfect, impenetrable camouflage of the invisible man. Los Angeles waited at the end of this 6-hour journey. A mahogany boardroom overlooking Century City, a gold-nibbed fountain pen resting on a green leather blotter, and a merger document that would finalize a $90 million acquisition by the end of the business day. The stakes required absolute precision. Every minute of the morning was mapped, every contingency planned for. Yet the true test of the day resided not within the hostile negotiations waiting in California, but within the glass and steel cathedral of Terminal 4. The automatic doors slid open, welcoming him into the chaotic hum of the departure hall. Isaiah paused, letting the manic energy of thousands of desperate travelers wash over him. Above the sprawling bank of check-in counters hung the massive, illuminated logo of Horizon Airlines. The silver and blue bird in flight. It was a logo he had redesigned himself 3 years ago. It was a company he owned, controlled by a web of holding companies and majority stakes that kept his name out of the public eye. He was not just a passenger today. He was the architect of the very airspace he was about to move through. The first-class priority lane was deserted, cordoned off by velvet ropes that signaled the invisible boundary between the elite and the ordinary. Isaiah stepped onto the plush crimson carpet, walking toward the sole agent manning the desk. The agent, a woman whose name tag read Margaret, did not look up from her monitor. Her fingers clattered aggressively against the keyboard, her posture rigid with the defensive exhaustion of someone who had already dealt with too many complaints before sunrise. Isaiah rested his passport and a digital boarding pass on the polished marble counter. Margaret's eyes flicked to the documents, then traveled slowly upward, taking in the casual gray hoodie, the absence of a structured blazer, the lack of a designer briefcase. Her manicured fingernails stopped tapping. The subtle, microscopic shift in her facial muscles told the entire story, the tightening of the jaw, the narrowing of the eyelids. It was the universal, silent calculus of assessing a stranger and finding them lacking. This line is reserved exclusively for priority and first-class passengers. Her voice was a flat, practiced monotone, devoid of the forced customer service warmth she had undoubtedly used for the business traveler who had just walked away. Isaiah did not move his hand from the counter. "I am flying first class to Los Angeles." Margaret sighed, a sharp intake of breath designed to communicate profound inconvenience. She snatched the passport, swiping it through the reader with unnecessary force. She stared at her monitor, the glowing blue light reflected in her glasses. A frown deeply etched itself into her forehead. She typed a rapid sequence of commands, deleted them, and typed them again. The system is flagging an anomaly with this reservation. I'm going to need to see the physical credit card used to purchase this fare. Isaiah's resting heart rate did not elevate. He understood the architecture of this interaction intimately. The booking was arranged through a corporate travel management account. The confirmation number, my government-issued identification, and the ticketed itinerary are sufficient to issue the boarding pass according to Horizon's published carriage guidelines. Margaret leaned back, crossing her arms over her uniform. Sir, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them to prevent fraudulent bookings. Without the card, I cannot verify you belong on this flight. Bias rarely announces itself with malice. It arrives wrapped in the sterile language of protocol. Isaiah reached calmly into his pocket, withdrawing a slim minimalist wallet. He slid a sleek, heavy piece of black titanium across the marble, an American Express Centurion card, the kind of financial instrument that required a $10,000 initiation fee and a personal invitation just to possess. Margaret stared at the heavy metal card. The silence stretched, brittle and awkward. She picked it up, her fingers hesitating over the raised lettering. The name matched. The account verified instantly on her terminal. The wall she had tried to build dissolved, leaving behind a residue of embarrassed resentment. She printed the boarding pass, the machine whirring loudly in the quiet space. Gate 42. Boarding begins in 40 minutes. She did not offer a smile. She did not offer eye contact. She pushed the documents toward him, eager to erase the interaction from her morning. Isaiah gathered his items with fluid grace. Thank you, Margaret. Have a productive shift. The walk toward the TSA security checkpoint provided no sanctuary. The terminal was a cross-section of American anxiety, a place where authority was absolute and compliance was mandatory. Isaiah bypassed the sprawling, snake-like queue of standard security and merged into the pre-check lane. He placed his duffel bag onto the conveyor belt, removed his bespoke sneakers, and walked through the metal detector. The machine remained silent. No alarms, no flashing lights. Sir, step to the side, please. The voice belonged to a TSA officer standing just beyond the scanner. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a tight buzz cut and eyes that tracked movement like a predator. He gestured toward a yellow footprint decal on the linoleum floor. Isaiah stepped onto the markers. Is there a problem? Random secondary screening. Keep your hands visible. The officer pulled a pair of blue nitrile gloves from a dispenser on his belt, snapping them over his wrists with a sharp, echoing pop. Isaiah looked around. 3 businessmen in tailored suits had just walked through the same scanner, grabbing their briefcases without a second glance from the security personnel. A family of 4 hurried past, gathering iPads and spilled snacks. Only Isaiah stood on the yellow footprints, an island of scrutinized stillness in a river of unrestricted movement. The officer ran a small white cloth over Isaiah's hands, swabbing the palms, the backs, the spaces between the fingers. He turned to a machine, inserted the cloth, and waited for the chemical analysis. The machine beeped a green clearance. I need to conduct a pat-down of your upper torso and legs. Spread your arms. The air in the terminal felt suddenly heavy. A few feet away, a young woman with a messy bun and an oversized denim jacket stopped loading her laptop into her backpack. Chloe Baker. She was 24, fueled by iced coffee and a hyper-awareness of social dynamics. Her eyes locked onto the scene. She recognized the pattern. She didn't reach for her phone yet, but her hands hovered over her pockets, her gaze sharp and analytical. Isaiah raised his arms, the physical indignity of a stranger's hands patting down his ribs, moving down his waist, checking the inseam of his jeans, was a familiar, exhausting ritual. It was the toll exacted for moving through the world in his skin. He had to remain perfectly still, perfectly calm. Any expression of frustration, any tightening of the jaw, any sigh of exhaustion would be immediately interpreted as aggression. To be a black man in an American airport was to exist in a constant state of emotional de-escalation, managing the fears and assumptions of everyone else in the room. The officer stepped back, peeling off the blue gloves. "You're cleared. Gather your belongings." Isaiah retrieved his duffel bag, sliding his feet back into his shoes. He caught Chloe Baker's eye for a fraction of a second. She offered a tight, sympathetic grimace. He offered nothing in return. He did not need pity. He needed data. He was here to audit the soul of his own company, and the data was proving to be a toxic accumulation of microaggressions. Terminal 4 stretched out in a long corridor of duty-free shops, overpriced coffee kiosks, and rows of uncomfortable black seating. Gate 42 was positioned at the far end, a wide glass expanse looking out over the tarmac where the massive Boeing 777 sat, connected to the jet bridge. The boarding area was already crowded, a tense ecosystem of travelers waiting for the boarding zones to be called. Isaiah found a quiet corner near the window, leaning his shoulder against the glass. He checked his watch. The Patek Philippe Nautilus, tucked discreetly under the sleeve of his hoodie, indicated 30 minutes until departure. His phone vibrated with an encrypted message from his Los Angeles legal team. The merger documents were prepped. The board was waiting. He typed a 2-word reply. "En route." The public address system crackled to life. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Horizon Airlines Flight 402 with service to Los Angeles is now beginning its boarding process. We would like to invite our first class and diamond tier members to board through lane 1 at this time." A synchronized rustle of movement swept through the waiting area. The business elite rose from their seats, a parade of rolling Toomey luggage and pressed slacks. Isaiah pushed off the glass and joined the line forming at the podium. The gate agent scanning boarding passes was young, his Horizon Airlines tie slightly askew. As Isaiah stepped up to the scanner, a man behind him let out a loud, performative sigh. Isaiah glanced back. William Preston, 55 years old, silver hair perfectly coiffed, a cashmere topcoat draped over his arm, a Breitling chronograph flashing on his wrist. Preston's face was pulled into a tight mask of impatient entitlement. When the world made William Preston wait, he took it as a personal insult. Isaiah turned back to the podium and held his digital pass under the red laser. The machine emitted a harsh, dissonant buzz. A red light flashed. The young gate agent looked at the screen, then at Isaiah. "I'm sorry, sir. This lane is for first-class boarding only. Group 4 will be called in about 20 minutes. The assumption was immediate, reflexive, and entirely predictable. The agent hadn't even read the error code on the screen. He had simply looked at the man, looked at the hoodie, and assigned him to the back of the aircraft. "The pass is for seat 2A, Isaiah said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant baritone that carried over the ambient noise of the terminal. "The scanner is rejecting the barcode. I suggest you refresh your departure manifest." Preston leaned around Isaiah, invading his personal space. "Look, buddy, if your ticket isn't scanning, step aside. Some of us actually belong on this flight and have places to be." The most dangerous walls are not built from stone, but from the quiet assumptions of good people who refuse to look at their own foundations. Isaiah did not step aside. He maintained his position, his physical presence an immovable object against the rushing tide of Preston's entitlement. The gate agent fumbled with his keyboard, flushing with nervous energy. He typed in the confirmation number manually. The screen blinked, turning green. The printer spat out a small paper receipt. "My apologies, Mr. Washington. It was a system glitch. You can go ahead down the jet bridge." Isaiah took the receipt. He did not look at Preston as he walked past the podium. But Chloe Baker, sitting 3 rows back waiting for Group 3, watched the entire exchange. This time her phone was already out. She wasn't recording, but her thumb rested on the camera icon. The pattern was establishing itself. She had seen enough viral videos to know how these subtle moments of friction often ended. The jet bridge was steep and smelled of industrial carpet cleaner. Isaiah walked down the enclosed ramp, the hollow sound of his footsteps echoing off the ribbed walls. He stepped through the heavy metal door of the aircraft, crossing the threshold into the pressurized sanctuary of the first-class cabin. The space was a study in engineered luxury, 14 lie-flat seats encased in sculpted privacy shells. Warm amber lighting washing over faux wood paneling, the scent of hot towels and brewing espresso filtering from the forward galley. Standing in the aisle, greeting passengers with a practiced, radiant smile was Brenda Walsh. 15 years in the sky had taught Brenda the precise topography of wealth. She knew how to read the subtle indicators of status. Wealth wore subtle tailoring. Wealth carried leather that aged beautifully. Wealth demanded sparkling water before the cabin doors even closed. Wealth, in her deeply ingrained, unexamined worldview, did not look like the man walking toward her in a faded gym hoodie. Her smile dropped, freezing into a mask of professional suspicion. It was the same look Margaret had given him at the check-in desk. The same look the TSA officer had given him at the scanner. The same look the gate agent had given him at the podium. It was the compounding interest of institutional bias. "Excuse me, sir," Brenda said, stepping sideways to block the aisle. "Economy class boarding hasn't commenced yet. You need to wait in the jet bridge." Isaiah stopped. He was 2 feet away from seat 2A. The embroidered headrest was right there. "I am in seat 2A. Brenda's eyes darted down to his hands. She was looking for the boarding pass, looking for proof, looking for anything to validate the dissonance in her brain. "May I see your boarding pass?" Isaiah handed her the physical receipt the gate agent had printed. Brenda studied the small slip of paper as if it were written in a foreign language. She turned it over. She checked the date. She checked the flight number. She was actively searching for a reason to deny reality. Finding none, she handed it back. The radiant smile did not return. "Row 2, on the left." She stepped aside, her body language stiff, conveying a profound sense of territorial reluctance. She did not offer to take his coat. She did not offer him a pre-flight beverage. Isaiah slid into the wide leather seat, stowing his duffel bag beneath the footrest. He leaned back, letting the ergonomic cushions absorb the tension radiating from his spine. The cabin began to fill, the rhythmic thumping of luggage wheels rolling down the aisle, the murmur of hushed, important conversations. A moment later, William Preston boarded. Brenda's posture transformed instantly. Her shoulders relaxed, her smile returned with genuine wattage, and she stepped forward to intercept him. "Mr. Preston, welcome back. It's a pleasure to have you flying with us today. May I take your coat?" Preston shrugged off the cashmere topcoat, handing it to her without looking at her. "Keep it near the front, Brenda. I don't want it crushed under someone's oversized carry-on." "Of course, sir. Your usual gin and tonic before takeoff?" "Make it a double, and lots of lime." Preston moved down the aisle, his eyes scanning the cabin. He stopped dead when he reached row 2. Preston looked at Isaiah. He looked at the seat number above the window. He looked back at Isaiah. The irritation that had sparked at the boarding gate ignited into full-blown outrage. "You're in my seat." Isaiah slowly turned his head. The Los Angeles merger documents were loaded on his encrypted tablet, but he placed the device face down on the center console. "This is seat 2A. Preston scoffed, a wet, ugly sound. "I fly this route every week. I always sit in 2A. My assistant booked it specifically. You need to check your ticket again, buddy, and move to the back." Dignity is not a garment you can strip away with a loud voice and a boarding pass. It is the bone structure of the soul. Isaiah did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He remained perfectly centered in the leather seat. "My boarding pass is for 2A. If there has been a ticketing error, I suggest you speak with the flight attendant." Brenda materialized at Preston's elbow, carrying a crystal glass of gin and tonic on a small silver tray. She sensed the escalation immediately. Her protective instincts flared, aligning entirely with the diamond medallion passenger. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Preston?" Preston pointed a thick finger at Isaiah. This guy is sitting in my seat. I want him moved. Brenda turned her gaze on Isaiah. The professional suspicion had hardened into cold authority. Sir, I need to see your boarding pass again. You reviewed my boarding pass 2 minutes ago when I boarded the aircraft, Isaiah replied softly. The quietness of his voice forced both Brenda and Preston to lean in to hear him. It was a tactical use of volume, controlling the energy of the space. I need to see it again to verify the seat assignment. Brenda's voice ticked up half an octave, the tension bleeding into her tone. Other passengers were stopping in the aisle, creating a bottleneck. The business executives in row 1 turned around in their seats, and walking down the aisle, clutching her oversized backpack, was Chloe Baker. Finding her seat in 3B directly behind the confrontation, she slipped into the row. This time the phone came out, the camera app opened. She rested the lens against her backpack, ensuring a clear, unobstructed angle of the scene unfolding in row 2. Isaiah pulled up the digital pass on his phone, the brightness illuminating his calm features. He held it up. Horizon Airlines, Flight 402, First Class, Seat 2A, Isaiah, Washington. Brenda stared at the screen. She blinked rapidly. This must be a duplicate booking error in the system. Mr. Preston is a Diamond Tier member. He has priority status for this seat. Priority status dictates upgrade wait lists and boarding order, Isaiah said, quoting the exact operational manual he had personally approved 2 years prior. It does not invalidate a confirmed paid first-class ticket for a seated passenger. The airline must accommodate Mr. Preston in another available first-class seat. There are no other available first-class seats, Brenda snapped, her patience evaporating. The man was using industry terminology. He was speaking with an authority that challenged her own. She felt the control of her cabin slipping away. The flight is completely full. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to the main cabin, and customer service will process a partial refund when we land in Los Angeles. Preston took a long sip of his gin, the ice clinking against the glass. He looked down at Isaiah with a sneer that belonged in a different century. Just get up and move. People like you aren't used to the service up here anyway. You'll survive, coach. The words hung in the pressurized air. People like you. It was the linguistic trigger, the silent alarm, the dog whistle blown at maximum volume. Chloe's thumb hit the red record button on her screen. The digital timer began ticking. 0001, 0002, 0003. Isaiah's dark eyes locked onto Brenda, bypassing Preston entirely. He was giving her the opportunity to correct the course. He was giving her the chance to step back from the precipice. Did you hear what he just said? Brenda's posture stiffened defensively. She ignored the question, doubling down on the only leverage she felt she had. Sir, if you do not voluntarily move to the economy cabin, I will consider you a disruptive passenger. You are interfering with the boarding process. I am sitting quietly in the seat I purchased, Isaiah replied. I am not moving. I am the lead flight attendant on this aircraft. You have to follow my instructions. Your instructions violate federal aviation regulations regarding carriage contracts as well as Horizon's own anti-discrimination protocols. Preston slammed his hand against the overhead compartment. Enough of this. Call the captain. Get this guy off the plane. Brenda spun on her heel and marched toward the forward galley. She picked up the red intercom handset, her fingers trembling slightly as she punched in the code for the flight deck. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Every eye was fixed on the man in the gray hoodie. Some looked with pity, others with irritation, but most looked with the paralyzing fear of the bystander. No one spoke. No one intervened. Chloe Baker's camera captured every second of the deafening silence. The heavy reinforced door of the cockpit swung open. Captain Robert Mitchell stepped into the cabin. 58 years old, silver hair neatly parted, his crisp white shirt weighed down by 4 gold stripes on each epaulette. He carried a slight paunch over his belt, but his posture radiated the absolute unquestioned authority of a man who commanded $100 million machine in the sky. He had flown for the military. He had flown for Horizon for 20 years. He did not negotiate. He dictated. Brenda met him at the edge of the galley, speaking in rapid, hushed tones, pointing toward row 2. Mitchell listened, his jaw setting into a hard line. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, and walked down the aisle. Mitchell stopped beside Preston, placing a reassuring hand on the VIP's shoulder, before turning his imposing frame toward Isaiah. "I'm Captain Mitchell. I understand we have a situation regarding this seat." Isaiah looked up at the gold stripes. Authority demands obedience, but true leadership requires the courage to ask the right question. Mitchell was not asking a question. He had already rendered a verdict based entirely on Brenda's whisper. "There is no situation, Captain. I hold a valid boarding pass for 2A. This passenger is attempting to claim it, and your flight attendant has asked me to downgrade to economy to accommodate him. My flight attendant informs me that you are being disruptive, refusing crew instructions and causing a delay in our departure." Mitchell's voice was deep, practiced to project calm during turbulence, but currently weaponized to intimidate. "Refusing an unlawful and discriminatory instruction is not a disruption. It is a boundary." Mitchell leaned closer, resting his hands on his hips, pushing his chest forward. "Let me make something perfectly clear to you. On my aircraft, I am the law. I do not care what your boarding pass says. I do not care what you think your rights are. My crew says you are a problem, and that is enough for me." "Captain Mitchell," Isaiah said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing the pilot to lean in further. "I strongly advise you to review the passenger manifest and verify my credentials before you take an action you will not be able to undo." "Are you threatening me?" Mitchell's face flushed red, the veins in his neck standing out against the white collar. "I am offering you a moment of clarity." Preston scoffed loudly. "He's bluffing. He probably bought the ticket with stolen miles. Just kick him to the curb so we can take off." Mitchell stood to his full height, pointing a rigid finger toward the front door of the aircraft. "You have exactly 30 seconds to gather your bag and exit this aircraft voluntarily. If you do not, I will summon airport security and you will be removed by force." The threat of physical violence had finally entered the space. The invisible walls of policy and procedure had failed to break the man, so the system fell back on its ultimate mechanism of control, physical force. Isaiah did not reach for his bag. He did not unbuckle his seatbelt. He looked directly into the lens of Chloe Baker's smartphone, visible just over the edge of the seat behind Preston. He looked at the faces of the silent passengers. He looked at Brenda, who stood with her arms crossed, vindicated by the captain's authority. And finally, he looked back at Mitchell. "I am not moving." Mitchell reached for the radio clipped to his belt, pressing the transmission button with his thumb. The static crackled loudly in the quiet cabin. "Ground control, this is Horizon 402. We have a level 2 disruption in the first-class cabin. Passenger refusing crew orders, dispatch port authority and armed security for immediate physical extraction." The die was cast, the machinery of escalation had been engaged, and there was no turning back. Isaiah rested his hands on his lap, feeling the soft cashmere of his hoodie beneath his fingertips, waiting for the arrival of the men who would try to break him. The heavy reinforced door of the cockpit clicked shut, a sharp metallic finality that sealed the ecosystem of the Boeing 777 into a pressurized tube of escalating hostility. Time stretched, warping under the weight of the collective anxiety radiating from the 150 souls trapped inside. The auxiliary power unit hummed beneath the floorboards, pumping cold, recycled air through the overhead vents. But the first-class cabin felt suffocatingly small. A grounded aircraft is a uniquely claustrophobic purgatory. There are no exits. There is no escape from the social friction. There is only the long, narrow aisle, and the invisible lines drawn between those who believe they own the space and those they believe are trespassing. William Preston refused to return to the boarding area. He paced the short distance between the forward galley and row 2, the leather soles of his Italian loafers slapping aggressively against the thin industrial carpet. His gin and tonic was half empty, the ice rattling like dry bones every time he gestured. He pulled a platinum smartphone from his breast pocket, aggressively tapping the screen. "Get me the platinum medallion priority desk, now!" Preston pressed the phone to his ear, his voice deliberately projected to ensure every passenger within 6 rows understood his influence. "Yes, this is William Preston. Account number ending in 449. I am currently standing in the aisle of Flight 402 because some squatter is refusing to vacate my assigned seat. Your crew is completely impotent. I want a regional manager on the line, and I want this element removed from the aircraft before I cancel my corporate account entirely." Isaiah Washington kept his hands resting lightly on his thighs. The soft, unbranded vicuña wool of his hoodie absorbed the chill of the cabin air. He did not look at Preston. He did not look at the other executives who were now openly staring, their expressions a mix of fascinated horror and quiet solidarity with the diamond-tier passenger. True power does not posture. True power sits in absolute stillness, allowing the insecure to exhaust their own oxygen. Isaiah was mapping the liability matrix in his head, cataloging every violation of Horizon Airlines' carriage contract, every breach of the anti-discrimination protocols he had personally drafted, and every failure of the human beings employed to uphold them. Brenda Walsh hovered in the galley, her face a mask of bureaucratic panic. She adjusted the silk scarf at her neck, the fabric suddenly feeling too tight. She had committed herself to a narrative, and the terrifying gravity of corporate hierarchy meant she could not backtrack without admitting catastrophic fault. She whispered furiously to the junior flight attendant, a young woman who looked terrified, clutching a stack of hot towels like a shield. Brenda's eyes darted repeatedly toward seat 2A. The man's profound calm was the most unnerving variable. Guilty people argued. Trespassers panicked. This man sat with the terrifying serenity of a predator, observing a trap he had already dismantled. Chloe Baker sat perfectly still in 3B, her thumbs hovering over the glowing interface of her smartphone. The live stream was active. The small red indicator pulsed in the corner of the screen, a digital heartbeat broadcasting the raw, unfiltered reality of Terminal 4 to the open internet. The viewer count began at 14. A minute later, it climbed to 300. The algorithmic machinery of outrage was spinning up, catching the metadata of her location and the tension in the frame. The lens was focused squarely on the back of the gray hoodie, capturing the aggressive pacing of the silver-haired executive and the frozen, hostile posture of the flight crew. "This is insane," Chloe whispered into the microphone, her voice barely a breath. "They're literally grounding the whole flight because he won't give up his ticketed seat to a white guy." The chat overlay began to scroll rapidly, a waterfall of text scrolling up the side of her screen. Strangers demanding context, trolls defending the airline, voices of pure righteous anger demanding the flight attendant's name. The digital courtroom had been convened and the jury was multiplying by the second. Preston ended his call, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He leaned over the curved plastic shell of seat 2A, invading the personal space of the man sitting there. The smell of premium gin, stale coffee, and expensive citrus cologne washed over the seat. "You think you've got a point to prove, buddy?" The venom in the executive's voice dropped to a guttural hiss, intended only for Isaiah. "You're just holding up 100 people who actually have jobs to get to. Whatever stunt you're pulling, it ends the second airport security drags your ass out of that leather." Isaiah slowly turned his head. The distance between their faces was less than 12 inches. The dark eyes of the man in the hoodie held no fear, no anger, only a cold, clinical assessment. A uniform grants authority, but only character grants legitimacy. The baritone vibration of the words cut through the ambient noise of the cabin. You are relying on borrowed authority to enforce an entitlement you do not possess. Step away from my seat. Preston flinched, physically recoiling from the absolute certainty in the tone. He blinked, his bravado briefly fracturing under the weight of the psychological pushback. He recovered a second later, his face flushing a deeper shade of crimson. He turned toward the galley. Brenda, are you just going to let him threaten me? Move his damn bag out of the footwell so I can sit down. Brenda stepped out of the galley, the tension in her spine making her movements jerky and unnatural. She walked to row 2, reaching over Isaiah's knees toward the bespoke leather duffel bag tucked securely beneath the footrest. It was a severe violation of personal property protocol, a desperate escalation to physically reclaim the territory she believed belonged to the Diamond member. Isaiah's hand moved with startling speed. He did not grab her wrist, but his palm flattened against the top of the leather bag, an impenetrable barrier. Do not touch my property. The flight attendant froze, her fingers inches from the leather. The air in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. The unwritten rules of civil aviation had just been shattered. Physical interference with a passenger's baggage without a declared security threat was a terminable offense. I am relocating your item to the forward closet to prepare this seat for its rightful ticket holder. Her voice shook, the manufactured customer service cadence entirely gone, replaced by the raw, reedy tone of fear. If you touch this bag, you cross the line from a civil dispute over a seating manifest into criminal interference with personal property. I suggest you retreat to your galley and wait for the authorities you summoned. Brenda pulled her hand back as if the leather were coated in battery acid. She retreated 2 steps, her chest heaving. She had built a cage of protocol, forgetting who owned the iron. She spun around and marched back to the forward door, staring out the small porthole window at the jet bridge, desperate for the sight of the flashing lights. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a rising tide of discontent. A businessman in 1D checked his watch, groaning loudly. A couple in 4A whispered furiously, the woman shaking her head in disgust while pointing at the gray hoodie. The psychology of the crowd was hardening. They did not care about the truth of the boarding pass. They did not care about the mechanics of the bias. They only cared about the delay. In the confined vacuum of a delayed aircraft, the person disrupting the schedule becomes the universal enemy, regardless of their innocence. Silence is the loudest accomplice to injustice, and the first-class cabin was deafeningly quiet in its complicity. The cockpit door unlatched again. Captain Robert Mitchell emerged holding a long strip of thermal paper printed from the ACARS data link system. The final passenger manifest. He walked down the aisle with heavy, deliberate steps, the gold stripes on his shoulders gleaming under the LED reading lights. He stopped beside Brenda, his eyes scanning the data. The system shows a duplicate assignment error for 2A, Mitchell announced, his voice booming over the heads of the passengers. The reservation for Mr. Preston is tied to a corporate Diamond account. The other reservation flagged a payment gateway anomaly at check-in. It is an invalid ticket. It was a lie born of technological ignorance, a misinterpretation of the very security patch Isaiah had authorized the IT department to implement 3 months prior to flag high-value corporate travel for secondary encryption. But to Mitchell, it was the absolute justification he needed. It was the smoking gun. Mitchell stopped at row 2. He did not look at Isaiah as a customer. He looked at him as a trespasser. The manifest confirms my flight attendant's assessment. Your boarding pass is invalid. You are currently trespassing on federal property. I am giving you one final opportunity to stand up, retrieve your bag, and exit the jet bridge. If you force me to have you removed, you will be permanently placed on the federal no-fly list. Isaiah looked at the thermal paper in the pilot's hand. He knew the exact string of code that had generated that printout. He knew the server farm in Virginia where the data was stored. Captain Mitchell, You are misinterpreting a Level 4 encryption flag as a payment anomaly. If you contact the operations center and request a manual override code, the ticket will validate. You are operating on an assumption based on a profound lack of technical understanding. Preston laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Listen to this guy. Now he's an IT expert. He's probably hacking the system from that tablet. Just cuff him, Captain. I am not calling operations. Mitchell folded the paper, slipping it into his shirt pocket. I am done negotiating with you. You have been given a direct order by the pilot in command. Your refusal is a violation of Federal Aviation Regulation 91.11. You are interfering with the duties of a crew member. I am defending myself against a discriminatory eviction based on the visual bias of your lead flight attendant, which you are now compounding with willful negligence. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed from the jet bridge. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, cutting off whatever response the captain was preparing. The cavalry had arrived. 2 armed officers from the airport police department stepped through the forward door. Gary Lawson walked in front, a massive wall of a man with a shaved head, a thick neck, and a utility belt heavily laden with a radio, a baton, pepper spray, and steel handcuffs. His hand rested instinctively on his belt. Behind him was Thomas Evans, younger, leaner, his eyes wide as he took in the strange, tense tableau of the first-class cabin. Lawson did not look at the passengers. He looked directly at the gold stripes. Captain, we got a call for a Level 2 disruption. What's the situation? Mitchell pointed a rigid finger at seat 2A. This individual is sitting in another passenger's assigned seat. His ticket is invalid. He has repeatedly refused crew instructions to relocate or deplane. He is hostile and combative. I want him off my aircraft immediately so we can push back. Lawson turned his heavy gaze toward the gray hoodie. The officer's posture shifted, widening his stance, entering the first phase of the force continuum. He saw a black man in casual clothing sitting in a space reserved for the wealthy. He saw the angry white executive hovering nearby. He saw the frazzled, terrified flight attendant. The narrative assembled itself perfectly in his mind, requiring no further investigation. Sir, grab your bag and step out of the row. Lawson's voice was a gravelly bark, designed to trigger immediate compliance. Isaiah did not reach for his bag. He looked up at the officer, his expression devoid of the panic Lawson was accustomed to seeing. Officer, before you escalate this situation, I recommend you ask the captain to provide documentation that my boarding pass is invalid rather than relying on a verbal assumption. Lawson stepped closer, his shadow falling across the leather seat. I don't need to look at paperwork. The captain wants you off the plane. That means you're getting off the plane. We can do this the easy way, where you walk up that jet bridge on your own 2 feet, or we can do it the hard way. Make your choice. Thomas Evans shifted uncomfortably behind his partner. He looked at the man in the seat. The man wasn't yelling. His hands were visible. There was no physical threat. Gary, maybe we should just check the pass. Quiet, Evans, Lawson snapped, never taking his eyes off Isaiah. The pilot is the law on the plane. He gave the order. We execute. Chloe's phone was burning hot in her palms. The viewer count on the live stream had shattered 5,000. The chat was moving so fast it was a blur of digital outrage. She zoomed in, framing the massive officer looming over the seated passenger. The contrast was terrifying. The sheer overwhelming threat of state-sanctioned violence pressing down on a man who had done nothing but ask for his receipt to be honored. I purchased this seat, Isaiah said, his voice dropping into a register of profound, immovable resolve. I hold a valid confirmation. I am not a threat to this flight. I am not moving. Lawson unclipped the radio from his shoulder. Dispatch, we have a non-compliant party on Flight 402. Initiating physical extraction. Last warning. Lawson reached down, his thick fingers hovering over the heavy black plastic of his handcuffs. Stand up. You are making a terrible mistake. Your problem, not mine. The violence, when it finally broke the heavy anticipation, was breathtakingly fast and shockingly brutal. Lawson lunged forward. He did not grab Isaiah's arm. He seized the heavy fabric of the cashmere hoodie at the shoulder, twisting his thick fist into the material to create a handle. With a guttural grunt of exertion, the massive officer hauled his weight backward, using the leverage to violently rip Isaiah upward from the deep leather seat. The physical shock of the assault tore through the quiet cabin. The bespoke fabric ripped with a sickening, expensive sound. Isaiah's shoulder wrenched forward, his center of gravity completely destroyed by the sudden, overwhelming kinetic force. "Don't touch me!" Isaiah's voice remained low, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream, though the pain in his rotator cuff flared like white-hot iron. "Stop resisting!" Lawson bellowed, the universal battle cry used to justify any level of brutality. Isaiah was not resisting. He was simply trying to maintain his balance as 250 pounds of aggressive law enforcement yanked him into the narrow aisle. But the lack of active compliance was all the excuse Lawson needed. Evans moved in from the side, adrenaline overriding his previous hesitation. He grabbed Isaiah's left wrist, twisting the arm violently behind the passenger's back. The angle was unnatural, pushing the joint toward the absolute limit of its mobility. Lawson slammed his heavy forearm against the back of Isaiah's neck, driving the man forward. Isaiah's boots slipped on the thin carpet. He pitched downward, unable to break his fall with his arms pinned. The side of his head slammed viciously against the hard, molded plastic shell of seat 3A. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the first-class cabin. The impact echoed with a hollow, sickening thud. A sharp, jagged edge of the plastic console bit deeply into the flesh just above Isaiah's right eyebrow. The skin split instantly. The warm, metallic taste of copper flooded his mouth as his teeth ground together to absorb the shockwave of the blow. A thick, dark ribbon of blood immediately welled up from the laceration, tracing a rapid path down his temple, cutting a stark crimson line across his cheekbone and dripping onto the collar of his ruined hoodie. "Get the cuffs on him! Lock him down!" Lawson shouted, his knee driving into the back of Isaiah's thigh, pinning the injured man against the armrest. The harsh, metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs filled the air. Click, click, click. The sound of a life being stripped of its autonomy. Evans clamped the cold steel around Isaiah's right wrist, squeezing the metal jaws shut with unnecessary force. The metal bit viciously into the delicate skin over the radial artery. The officer yanked the left arm back, forcing the second cuff closed. Click, click, click. The cuffs were agonizingly tight. The hard edges sliced off the circulation instantly, sending a wave of burning numbness shooting down through Isaiah's fingers. The plastic edges of the restraint dug into the median nerve. It was designed to inflict maximum discomfort, a physical mechanism to break the spirit. "The cuffs are cutting off my circulation." Isaiah stated the fact clearly, his chest heaving against the hard plastic of the seat shell. The blood dripped steadily from his temple, leaving dark, heavy stains on the pristine cream leather of the armrest. "Should have thought about that before you resisted," Lawson sneered, grabbing the steel chain connecting the cuffs. He used it as a handle, yanking upward with vicious, tearing force. Isaiah was hauled to his feet. The pain in his shoulders was blinding, the joints screaming against the unnatural torque. He stood in the center of the aisle, a billionaire treated like a vagrant, bleeding onto the floor of his own aircraft. He looked up, his vision swimming slightly from the head trauma, but his focus remained terrifyingly absolute. He looked at Captain Mitchell. The pilot had backed away against the bulkhead, his face suddenly pale, the smug authority evaporating as the physical reality of the violence stained his pristine cabin. He looked at Brenda Walsh, whose hands were clamped over her mouth in horror, finally realizing the catastrophic chain reaction her assumptions had triggered. He looked at William Preston, who was staring at the blood on the leather seat, stepping backward, suddenly desperate to distance himself from the brutality he had demanded. And then Isaiah looked down the aisle. Over 100 passengers from the economy cabin had unbuckled their seatbelts, crowding the aisle, craning their necks to see the commotion. A sea of glowing rectangles, 50, 60, 70 smartphones were raised in the air, capturing the blood, the steel, the torn cashmere, and the heavy, panting breaths of the aggressive officers. Chloe Baker was standing on her seat now, her phone held high above the privacy shell. Her hands were shaking violently, but the camera remained perfectly steady. The viewer count on her screen had gone entirely exponential. 20,000, 30,000. The algorithmic fire had breached containment. The digital world was watching the blood fall. "Move!" Lawson shoved Isaiah in the center of the back. Isaiah stumbled forward, his balance severely compromised by his pinned arms. Every step sent a jolt of burning agony radiating from his wrists. The walk down the aisle was the ultimate theater of humiliation. It was the modern equivalent of the stocks, a public parading of the broken and the non-compliant. The faces of the passengers blurred into a mosaic of shock, apathy, and morbid curiosity. The bystander effect was absolute. Good people, decent people, families on vacation, business travelers, checking emails. They all watched a bleeding man drag through the cabin, and no one raised a single hand to stop it. They raised their lenses, but they kept their voices buried. The officers pushed him through the forward galley, past the silent, terrified junior flight attendants, and shoved him violently through the heavy aircraft door. The transition from the climate-controlled cabin to the cold, industrial chill of the jet bridge was jarring. The steep incline of the ramp made the forced march even more treacherous. Lawson kept the pressure on the handcuff chain, forcing Isaiah to walk at an unnaturally rapid pace, his boots scuffing heavily against the ribbed rubber flooring. "You picked the wrong day to play games, buddy," Lawson muttered, his breath hot against the back of Isaiah's neck. "You're catching a federal charge, assaulting an officer, interfering with a flight crew. You're going to be sitting in a holding cell for a very long time." Isaiah tasted the blood pooling in the corner of his mouth. He took a slow, deep breath, expanding his chest against the pain. The physical humiliation was absolute, but his internal architecture remained untouchable. He had the data, he had the video evidence captured by 100 strangers. He had the exact measure of the rot infecting the lower levels of his empire. They reached the top of the jet bridge, bursting through the heavy security door and out into the glaring fluorescent light of the departure terminal. The gate area was chaotic. Passengers waiting for other flights stopped dead in their tracks. Conversations evaporated, children pointed. The visual was shocking. A massive police officer dragging a bleeding, handcuffed black man whose clothes were torn and stained. It was an image burned into the American subconscious. A repetitive historical loop playing out in high definition beneath the glowing Horizon Airlines logo. "I need medical attention," Isaiah said, his voice steady, refusing to slur despite the swelling in his lip. "And I need to make a phone call." "You don't get a phone call until you're booked at the precinct," Evans said, walking backward to clear the path through the stunned crowd of onlookers. "If you deny me medical evaluation for a head trauma sustained in your custody, the liability shifts from corporate to personal." Isaiah stopped walking, planting his feet firmly on the marble floor. The sudden anchor forced Lawson to jerk to a halt, the handcuffs biting even deeper into the bone. "I am making a phone call. Now!" Lawson raised his baton, ready to strike the back of Isaiah's knees to force him moving again. But he caught sight of the crowd. Dozens of people in the terminal had their phones out, recording the standoff. The officer's aggressive momentum faltered. The modern panopticon was watching. "Fine." Lawson shoved Isaiah roughly against the wall next to the boarding podium. The impact rattled Isaiah's teeth, smearing a fresh streak of blood against the pristine white paint. "You get 1 minute. Evans, pull his phone from his pocket. Do not uncuff him. Put it on speaker." Evans reached tentatively into the pocket of the ruined cashmere hoodie. He pulled out the slim matte black smartphone. The screen was cracked from the impact against the seat console, a spiderweb of shattered glass over the display. "Unlock it," Evans ordered, holding the device up to Isaiah's face for the biometric scan. The screen blinked, recognizing the bruised and bleeding face of its owner. The phone unlocked. "Dial the contact labeled Archangel." Evans tapped the screen, scrolling rapidly through the contacts. He found the designation. He hit the call button, engaged the external speaker, and held the phone inches from Isaiah's mouth. The line rang once, a sharp, encrypted digital tone. The voice that answered did not sound like a lawyer, a family member, or a bail bondsman. It was a crisp, hyper-professional female voice, speaking with the rapid-fire efficiency of a military command center. "Archangel Command, authentication required." Isaiah leaned his bleeding face toward the shattered glass. He did not sound like a victim. He did not sound like a man in handcuffs. He sounded like the architect of the sky. "Authentication. Vance Sierra Niner. Code Black." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. The professional veneer instantly vanished, replaced by an undercurrent of absolute terrifying urgency. "Authentication confirmed, Mr. Washington. We are tracking a biometrics alert. Are you injured?" "Minor trauma. I am currently detained by airport police at Gate 42. "Listen to me very carefully." "Recording, sir." Isaiah looked past the glowing screen of his phone. He looked at the two officers whose expressions were beginning to shift from aggressive certainty to profound confusion. He looked at the gate agent hiding behind the podium. He looked at the massive Horizon Airlines Boeing 777 sitting on the tarmac outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Ground the plane. Halt all pushback procedures. Cancel the clearance. Flight 402 does not leave this airport." "Copy that, sir. Grounding Flight 402 immediately. Who are we notifying?" "Contact the governor's office, contact the FAA regional director, and mobilize the entire corporate executive board. Tell them to get to Terminal 4 right now." "They are in the Manhattan office, sir. It will take them. I don't care if they have to commandeer a helicopter. Have them here in 20 minutes. Shut it all down." The line clicked dead. The silence in the terminal was absolute. The background noise of the airport seemed to fade away entirely. Gary Lawson stared at the cracked phone in his partner's hand. The massive officer swallowed hard, a cold knot of dread suddenly forming in the pit of his stomach. The man bleeding against the wall hadn't called for help. He had called down thunder. "Who the hell did you just call?" Lawson demanded, the bluster draining rapidly from his voice. Isaiah leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes as a drop of blood fell from his chin, staining the marble floor. "I told you," Isaiah whispered, the exhaustion finally bleeding into his tone, replaced by the terrifying, inevitable weight of absolute power. "You made a mistake." The heavy, pressurized door of the cockpit sealed shut with a vault-like thud, locking Captain Robert Mitchell inside his domain of glass, steel, and illuminated dials. The ambient noise of the cabin instantly vanished, replaced by the low, comforting hum of the avionics cooling fans. Mitchell settled his imposing frame into the left seat, exhaling a long, ragged breath that fogged the edge of the primary flight display. He reached up, adjusting his silver hair in the reflection of the side window, smoothing the crisp fabric of his uniform collar. Order had been restored. The hierarchy of the aircraft had been brutally challenged, but the application of force had re-established the natural boundaries of his world. He rested his hands on the thrust levers, the cool plastic grounding his adrenaline. "Horizon 402 to Kennedy ground. Disturbance neutralized. Offloading complete. Requesting clearance to push back from Gate 42 and commence taxi sequence to runway 4 left." The radio remained silent for 4 seconds. In the highly orchestrated ballet of international air traffic control, a 4-second delay is an eternity. It is the audio equivalent of a sudden dark shadow passing over the sun. "Horizon 402 Kennedy ground. Negative on your pushback clearance. Hold your position." Mitchell frowned, his thumb pressing hard against the transmit button on his yoke. Kennedy ground, Horizon 402. We are 35 minutes behind schedule. The disruptive element has been removed by Port Authority. We are buttoned up and ready to go. The voice that crackled back through the headset did not belong to the standard ground controller. The cadence was entirely different. It lacked the bored, rapid-fire rhythm of a man managing a dozen aluminum tubes on a tarmac. It was a voice tight with stress, carrying the unmistakable weight of a deeply terrified superior. Captain Mitchell, this is the JFK Tower supervisor. Cut your auxiliary power unit. Kill your engines immediately. A Level 1 ground stop has just been issued exclusively for your tail number. You are not moving. A ground stop? Supervisor, there is no weather cell between here and Los Angeles. There is no mechanical failure. I am the pilot in command and my aircraft is airworthy. Your aircraft is a crime scene, Captain. The words struck the cockpit glass like physical projectiles. The first officer, a young man who had remained entirely silent during the altercation in the cabin, slowly turned his head, his eyes wide with sudden, paralyzing fear. I am patching through a priority override from the Federal Aviation Administration Regional Director, countersigned by the Office of the Governor of New York. Do not touch your controls, Mitchell. Federal marshals are currently breaching the tarmac perimeter. If you initiate pushback, you will be intercepted by tactical vehicles. Acknowledge. Mitchell stared blindly at the glowing artificial horizon on his display. The instrument indicated the plane was perfectly level, but the entire foundation of his reality had just inverted. He opened his mouth, but the arrogant certainty that had fueled his commands 10 minutes ago had completely evaporated, leaving behind a dry, choking dust. Horizon 402, copy. Powering down. Out in the first-class cabin, the sudden whining deceleration of the auxiliary power unit sent a physical shudder through the floorboards. The warm amber lighting flickered, dimming by 30%. The flow of recycled air through the overhead vents abruptly ceased, instantly thickening the atmosphere. Brenda Walsh was standing beside row 2, offering a fresh double-poured gin and tonic to William Preston. The crystal glass vibrated against the silver tray in her hands. She looked toward the cockpit door, her heavily mascaraed eyes darting nervously. The engines were supposed to be spooling up. The safety demonstration was supposed to be playing. The silence was wrong. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a looming catastrophe. Preston took the glass, oblivious to the atmospheric shift. He settled back into the deep leather of 2A, the seat he had claimed through intimidation and proxy violence. He smoothed the lapels of his tailored shirt, crossing his legs with the expansive posture of a conquering king. Took longer than it should have, Brenda, but you handled it. Some people just need to be reminded where the boundaries are drawn. Yes, Mr. Preston. Thank you, sir. Her voice trembled so violently she had to bite her lower lip to stop the vibration. She looked down at the cream-colored leather of the armrest. A single dark smear of blood stained the pristine material. It was a stark, undeniable record of the brutality she had set into motion. She grabbed a linen napkin from her cart, scrubbing frantically at the stain, but the crimson had already sunk into the porous grain of the leather. It would not wash away. 300 yards away, under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the terminal, the digital execution of the Horizon Airlines executive board was already underway. Chloe Baker's live stream had bypassed the viral threshold and entered the realm of global breaking news. The viewer count ticking in the upper left corner of her shattered screen read 142,000. The chat overlay was moving so rapidly it was a solid white blur of text. Algorithms designed to pause monetization on violent content had triggered, but the sheer volume of organic shares overwhelmed the automated moderation. The footage of the blood, the torn cashmere, the steel cuffs cutting into flesh. It was being downloaded, mirrored, remixed, and broadcast across every major social network on the planet. Gary Lawson stood with his broad back to the boarding podium. His massive hands were hooked into his utility belt, but his fingers were twitching. The adrenaline surge that had propelled him to rip a man from a seat was fading, leaving a cold, hollow void in his chest. He looked at the man standing against the wall. Isaiah Washington had not moved. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders squared despite the agonizing torque on his rotator cuffs. The blood from the laceration above his eye had tracked down his cheek, dripping steadily onto the marble floor. He did not look at the officers. He looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Boeing 777 sitting dead on the tarmac. Officer Thomas Evans took a step backward, his hand hovering near his radio. The device was vibrating constantly, a silent, frantic pulse against his hip. Every channel was blowing up. The secure precinct frequencies were absolute chaos. "Gary, not now, Evans. Keep your eyes on the suspect." "Gary, look at your phone." Lawson pulled his personal smartphone from his pocket. The lock screen was flooded with notifications. Text messages from other officers, news alerts from local affiliates, a direct message from his union representative containing only 3 words. "What did you do?" The radio on Lawson's shoulder erupted, slicing through the ambient noise of the terminal. It was the voice of the Port Authority police chief, a man Lawson had spoken to exactly twice in his 10-year career. The chief was not using 10 codes, he was screaming. "Lawson, Evans, do not move that suspect, do not process him. Step exactly 5 paces away from him and put your hands where he can see them. If you touch him again, I will personally throw you in the federal penitentiary." Lawson's jaw dropped. He looked at the radio, then at the bleeding man in the ruined hoodie. The arrogant certainty of his uniform melted into a puddle of absolute terrifying comprehension. Arrogance builds the guillotine, but ignorance pulls the lever. Lawson had pulled the lever with both hands, entirely unaware of the neck resting on the block. "Sir?" Lawson's voice was a ragged whisper. The authoritative bark was gone. "Who are you?" Isaiah turned his head slowly. The dark eyes locked onto the officer carrying the weight of a storm about to break. "You equated compliance with dignity and in doing so surrendered both." Outside the glass, the perimeter of the tarmac was breached. 3 massive matte black Chevrolet Suburbans tore across the concrete, their emergency strobe lights flashing blindingly in the overcast morning light. They bypassed the security checkpoints, ignoring the painted taxiway lines, driving with the reckless, terrifying speed of absolute panic. They skidded to a halt directly beneath the jet bridge of Gate 42. A second later, the deep, percussive thumping of rotor blades rattled the terminal windows. A twin-engine Sikorsky helicopter, painted in the corporate colors of Horizon Airlines, dropped out of the low cloud cover. It flared aggressively, touching down on the outer tarmac with a screech of rubber. The doors of the Suburbans flew open. Men and women in sharp, dark suits sprinted across the concrete toward the terminal access doors. Among them was Philip Crawford. As the regional director of passenger operations, Crawford was the architect of the unwritten policies that allowed flight crews to arbitrarily downgrade passengers to avoid confrontation with wealthy clients. He was sweating through his bespoke shirt, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. 10 minutes ago, Crawford had been eating a croissant in the executive lounge. Then the CEO's private line had rung. The scream that had come through the receiver had nearly shattered Crawford's eardrum. Crawford burst through the terminal security doors, flanked by the chief legal officer and a phalanx of corporate crisis managers. He sprinted down the concourse, his dress shoes slipping on the polished marble. The crowd of passengers parted before the stampede of suits. They reached Gate 42. Crawford skidded to a halt, the breath tearing from his lungs. He saw the 2 officers standing frozen, their hands held awkwardly away from their bodies. He saw the crowd of hundreds of travelers holding up their phones. And then he saw the man leaning against the wall, the blood, the steel cuffs, the torn vicuña wool. Crawford's knees buckled. He actually reached out, grabbing the edge of the boarding podium to keep from collapsing to the floor. The face from the confidential shareholder reports. The face of the man who held a 62% controlling stake in the holding company that owned every airplane, every terminal lease, and every paycheck in Crawford's entire universe. "Oh my God!" The chief legal officer, a ruthless corporate attorney named Sarah Jenkins, did not freeze. She marched directly toward Gary Lawson, moving with the lethal precision of a guided missile. "Unlock those handcuffs immediately." Lawson held his ground, though his hands were shaking. "Ma'am, step back. This is an active police matter. The suspect is under arrest for assaulting a crew member and—" "You have no suspect!" Jenkins's voice echoed off the high ceilings, a weaponized corporate roar. "You have unlawfully detained the chairman of the board of Horizon Airlines. You have committed felony assault, false imprisonment, and gross civil rights violations on federal property. If you do not remove those cuffs in the next 3 seconds, I will personally ensure your grandchildren are paying off the civil settlement." The Port Authority police chief arrived, sprinting from the opposite direction, his gold badge bouncing wildly on his chest. He didn't even speak. He shoved Lawson aside with a violent sweep of his arm, grabbed the keys from the officer's belt, and scrambled toward Isaiah. "Mr. Washington, sir, I am so sorry. Hold still, just hold still." The chief's hands were trembling so badly he dropped the keys twice before finally inserting the small metal prong into the locking mechanism. Click. The heavy steel jaws snapped open. Isaiah slowly brought his arms forward. The skin around his wrists was mangled, deeply bruised with angry purple and black contusions where the metal had bitten into the bone. The sudden rush of blood returning to the ischemic tissue burned like fire. He did not wince. He did not rub the wounds. He simply let the heavy steel cuffs clatter to the marble floor, the sound ringing out in the absolute silence of the terminal. An executive assistant materialized at his side, holding a pristine, damp white towel in a dark navy-tailored suit jacket. Isaiah took the towel. He pressed it gently against the deep laceration over his eye, wiping away the wet blood though the cut continued to seep. He handed the ruined, bloody towel back to the assistant. He reached up, grasping the torn collar of the cashmere hoodie. With a single sharp motion, he pulled the ruined garment over his head, discarding it onto the floor next to the handcuffs. He slid his bruised arms into the sleeves of the tailored jacket. The transformation was absolute. The armor was equipped, the camouflage was gone. He was no longer the invisible man in the gray hoodie. He was the emperor, standing amid the ruins of the arrogance his subordinates had built. "Mr. Washington," Crawford stammered, taking a hesitant step forward, his hands clasped together in a posture of desperate supplication. "Sir, we had no idea. The crew, the police, it was a catastrophic breakdown of communication. We are mobilizing a full medical team. We have a private jet spooling up on the South Tarmac to get you to Los Angeles. We will handle this quietly." Isaiah looked at Crawford. The gaze was devoid of anger. It was completely terrifyingly hollow. "Justice delayed is a systemic choice." Crawford blinked, the corporate jargon dying in his throat. "You want quiet, Philip, because quiet protects the system. Quiet allows you to fire a flight attendant and draft a press release while the foundation remains rotten. There will be no private jet. We are going back onto that aircraft." Isaiah turned his back on the executives. He walked toward the heavy security door leading to the jet bridge. The procession that followed him was surreal. The billionaire chairman, bleeding and bruised, leading a phalanx of terrified corporate lawyers, sweating executives, and deeply panicked police commanders down the steep industrial carpeted ramp. At the rear of the column walked 4 men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back. The federal machinery had been activated. The heavy door of the Boeing 777 remained open. Inside the first-class cabin, the tension had reached a critical mass. The passengers were trapped in their seats, staring out the windows at the swarm of police vehicles. Chloe Baker had lowered her phone slightly, her arms aching, but the live stream continued to broadcast. The viewer count was crossing 500,000. Footsteps echoed from the jet bridge, not the heavy, aggressive thud of tactical boots, but the synchronized, purposeful march of absolute authority. Isaiah Washington stepped through the bulkhead door. The collective intake of breath from the cabin was audible. He was wearing the bespoke navy blazer, the cut immaculate, emphasizing the broad lines of his shoulders. The pristine white shirt underneath was a stark contrast to the dark, swollen bruise forming around his right eye and the fresh blood seeping from his temple. He walked down the aisle. He did not look at the passengers. He stopped directly in front of row 2. William Preston was frozen in seat 2A. The gin and tonic sat untouched on the center console. The executive's arrogant posture had collapsed entirely. He looked up at the man he had just ordered dragged from the aircraft, his eyes wide, tracking the expensive tailoring, the corporate entourage filling the galley behind him, and the grim-faced federal agents blocking the exit. Brenda Walsh stood backed against the galley counter. Her hands were clutching the edge of the plastic so tightly her knuckles were white. The linen napkin stained with blood was still clutched in her fist. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit, his face pale, his uniform suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He saw the regional director, he saw the lawyers, he saw the federal windbreakers, and then he looked at the bleeding man standing in the aisle. "Sir," Mitchell began, his voice cracking, the deep, commanding baritone entirely absent. I was informed there was a ticketing anomaly. I was following standard security protocol for a disruptive. A title is a shield, but ownership is the sword. The words cut through the cabin, echoing off the curved plastic ceiling. Isaiah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You relied on a title to enforce a prejudice. You weaponized your authority to protect the fragility of a man who believed he was entitled to a space I had purchased. You did not ask for evidence. You did not seek truth. You sought compliance. Mitchell swallowed, a heavy, audible gulp. Who are you? Isaiah looked at the pilot, then at the flight attendant, and finally down at the man shrinking into the leather seat. My name is Isaiah Washington. I own this company. The revelation detonated in the confined space. It was a psychological shockwave that shattered every assumption, every defense mechanism, and every justification the antagonists had built. Brenda Walsh actually collapsed. Her knees gave out and she slid down the face of the galley cabinets, hitting the floor with a soot thud. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with violent, silent sobs. The reality of what she had done, the assumptions she had made based entirely on the color of a man's skin and the fabric of his clothing, crashed down upon her with the weight of an anvil. She had humiliated the architect of her own livelihood. Preston pressed his back deep into the seat cushions, trying to put as much physical distance between himself and Isaiah as geometrically possible. Listen to me. I didn't know. The flight attendant told me it was my seat. I was just trying to get to a meeting. I'm a Diamond member. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. Your money purchased a ticket, Mr. Preston. It did not purchase my dignity. Isaiah turned slightly, gesturing to the chief legal officer standing in the galley. Revoke his medallion status. Cancel his corporate account. Ban him and his affiliated subsidiaries from booking travel on Horizon Airlines, effective permanently. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The platinum armor he had worn his entire life had just been stripped away, leaving him entirely exposed. You can't do that, Preston finally gasped. I'll sue. I'll take this entire airline to court. You are welcome to try, but I assure you the discovery process will be far more painful for your reputation than it will be for my balance sheet. Isaiah turned his attention to the 2 airport police officers, Lawson and Evans, who had been marched onto the plane by their chief. They stood near the forward door, stripped of their utility belts, their expressions utterly vacant. The two FBI agents stepped forward, moving with practiced, dispassionate efficiency. Gary Lawson, Thomas Evans. The lead agent produced a pair of federal handcuffs, the metal gleaming dully under the cabin lights. You are under arrest for felony assault under color of law, battery, and deprivation of rights. Turn around and place your hands behind your backs. Lawson did not resist. The fight had been entirely drained from his massive frame. He turned slowly, presenting his wrists. The heavy, terrifying click of the steel restraints locking into place echoed through the silent cabin. The exact same sound that had humiliated Isaiah 20 minutes earlier now signaled the destruction of two careers and the beginning of a brutal federal prosecution. Karma is not a mystical force. It is the inevitable collision of arrogance and accountability. Walk them out, the agent ordered. The officers were led down the aisle, their heads bowed, forced to march past the glowing screens of 100 smartphones. The digital jury that had witnessed the assault now witnessed the immediate, unyielding consequences. Isaiah looked at Philip Crawford. The regional director was sweating so profusely his collar was soaked through. Philip, 3 months ago I sent a memo to your office demanding an audit of the passenger downgrade protocols. I highlighted a statistical anomaly showing a disproportionate number of minority passengers being removed from premium cabins to accommodate elite-tier complaints. You replied that it was a software glitch. Crawford wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. Sir, the data was inconclusive. We were conducting a secondary review. You lied to protect the elite-tier revenue stream. You insulated the crew from accountability. Isaiah's voice remained devastatingly calm. You are terminated. For cause. Your pension is frozen pending a forensic audit of your department. Escort him off my aircraft. Corporate security flanked Crawford immediately, placing hands on his elbows, guiding the broken executive toward the exit. Captain Mitchell took a step forward, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. Mr. Washington, please. I have 20 years with this company. I have a family. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake based on bad information. Don't take my wings. Isaiah studied the pilot. The silver hair, the gold stripes, the desperate, pleading eyes of a man who suddenly realized the world did not bend to his uniform. We are measured not by the rules we follow, but by the humanity we discard to uphold them. Mitchell flinched as if struck. You did not make a mistake, Captain. You made a choice. You looked at a man sitting quietly in his seat and you chose to see a threat. You defended a seat, but you lost the sky. You are terminated. Leave your epaulets on the console and exit the aircraft. Mitchell's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached up to his shoulders. He unbuttoned the gold-striped epaulets, the symbols of his entire identity, and placed them gently onto the center console of Seat 2A. He turned and walked away, a ghost haunting his own ship. Brenda Walsh was still on the floor, weeping openly. Isaiah did not address her. Her termination was implicit. The silence he offered her was far more devastating than any words he could have spoken. Isaiah turned slowly, facing the first-class cabin. The executives in row 1, the couple in row 4, the dozens of passengers who had watched him bleed, who had listened to the steel cuffs ratcheting closed, and who had said absolutely nothing. He looked directly at the lens of Chloe Baker's smartphone. The red recording light was still pulsing. The world was still watching. Silence is the architecture of complicity. The words blanketed the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Passengers looked down at their laps. Executives suddenly found their tray tables fascinating. The collective shame was a tangible physical weight in the air. Every person in this cabin witnessed an injustice today. You watched a man abused because of the clothes he wore and the color of his skin. And you remained seated. You protected your itineraries. You protected your comfort. Isaiah reached up, gently touching the bandage an EMT had hurriedly taped over his laceration before he boarded. This aircraft is now an active federal crime scene. This flight is canceled. You will all be deplaned, your tickets will be fully refunded, and Horizon Airlines will provide you with alternative transportation. But as you walk through this terminal today, I want you to remember what you did not do. Power does not corrupt when it is challenged. Power corrupts when it is tolerated. He turned back toward the jet bridge, the tailored navy suit hanging perfectly over his bruised shoulders. The executive scrambled to part the way for him. The federal agents nodded respectfully as he passed. The revelation was complete. The armor of the institution had been shattered from the inside out. The invisible man had stepped into the light, and the shadows he cast would permanently alter the landscape of the sky. The heavy mahogany gavel struck the sounding block, a sharp, percussive crack that echoed through the cavernous federal courtroom of the Southern District of New York. The sound finalized the destruction of a life built on unexamined prejudice. 6 months had passed since the grounded Boeing 777 became a global spectacle, but the air inside the courtroom felt just as suffocating. The digital live stream had sparked the fire, but the slow grinding machinery of the federal justice system was now reducing the architects of that humiliation to ash. Gary Lawson stood before the judge. He was no longer a massive wall of authority draped in tactical nylon and polished brass. He wore the shapeless, muted khaki of a federal inmate. His broad shoulders slouched, the arrogant certainty entirely hollowed out by months of pre-trial confinement. His wrists, once accustomed to applying steel to the flesh of others, were now bound by heavy transportation chains. The federal prosecutor, a relentless attorney who had built her career dismantling institutional corruption, projected a sprawling spreadsheet onto the courtroom monitors. The data was irrefutable. It was the Horizon 47. 47 separate incidents spanning a 5-year period where minority passengers had been systematically downgraded, removed, or detained by airport security at the behest of Horizon flight crews. A retired schoolteacher from Atlanta took the witness stand. Her voice trembled as she recounted being dragged off a flight to Miami because her legitimate upgrade had been deemed suspicious by a gate agent. A young software engineer from Seattle described being threatened with the federal no-fly list simply for asking for a vegetarian meal in premium economy. They were the ghosts of the system, the invisible victims whose dignity had been sacrificed to maintain the pristine, unchallenged comfort of the elite tier. The judge leaned forward, his expression carved from absolute disgust. A uniform without empathy is simply a threat disguised as duty. You did not protect the sky, Mr. Lawson. You polluted it with your own bias. The sentence fell like a guillotine. 60 months in federal prison for felony deprivation of civil rights under color of law, loss of all law enforcement credentials permanently, complete forfeiture of his municipal pension. Lawson did not weep. He simply stared at the hardwood floor, the reality of his own ruin finally eclipsing the blind obedience he had weaponized. Thomas Evans received 36 months. His hesitation on the aircraft had not saved him from the consequences of his complicity. Silence in the presence of brutality is an endorsement of the act. The criminal convictions were merely the opening salvo. The civil litigation that followed was a masterclass in total financial annihilation. Captain Robert Mitchell never faced a jury, but his punishment was infinitely more agonizing for a man defined entirely by his status. The Horizon Airlines internal tribunal had stripped his wings within 48 hours of the incident. The Federal Aviation Administration, under massive public and congressional pressure, permanently revoked his commercial transport rating. He would never command an aircraft again. 2 years later, the heavy rain of a Tuesday evening pounded against the windshield of a deeply dented Toyota Camry crawling through the gridlock of the Queens Midtown Tunnel. Mitchell gripped the worn leather steering wheel, his knuckles white. The digital rideshare application mounted on his dashboard chimed, indicating a new passenger pickup 3 blocks away. His silver hair had thinned, his posture collapsing inward under the crushing weight of personal bankruptcy. The multi-million-dollar civil judgments awarded to the Horizon 47 victims had liquidated his retirement accounts, his sprawling waterfront property in Connecticut, and his children's college funds. He pulled the Camry to the curb. A young corporate executive climbed into the back seat, shaking the rain from his umbrella. The passenger did not look up from his phone. "Terminal 4, JFK, and step on it. I have first-class boarding in 40 minutes. Mitchell's chest tightened, a phantom pain radiating through his shoulders. "Yes, sir. Terminal 4. He engaged the transmission, a ghost ferrying the living toward a sky he was no longer permitted to touch. Brenda Walsh found her exile in the fluorescent purgatory of an overnight diner on the New Jersey Turnpike. The aviation industry had blacklisted her instantly. The hospitality sector, terrified of the viral infamy attached to her face, refused her applications. She wiped down a sticky laminate table with a bleach-soaked rag, the harsh chemicals burning her cracked cuticles. A group of truck drivers in the corner booth shouted for coffee refills. She walked toward them, her spine aching. There were no tailored silk scarves here. There were no first-class galleys or premium international routes. There was only the brutal, grinding reality of minimum wage survival. She poured the bitter coffee, her eyes dropping to the stained linoleum floor. She had built a worldview based on the assumption of superiority, and the universe had responded by forcing her to serve those she had once considered entirely beneath her notice. The memory of the blood staining the cream leather armrest of Seat 2A haunted her nightmares, a permanent stain on her soul. William Preston experienced a different velocity of destruction. The digital mob is ruthlessly efficient when provided with a target. Within hours of his corporate account being publicly revoked by Isaiah Washington, Preston's identity had been crowdsourced and weaponized. The board of directors at his logistics firm convened an emergency meeting while Preston was still trying to secure a commercial flight out of New York. By the time he landed in Los Angeles, he was entirely unemployed. The morality clause in his contract was triggered, terminating his golden parachute. His equity was frozen. His wife, a socialite whose entire existence was predicated on pristine public perception, filed for divorce before the end of the fiscal quarter. He spent his days in a sparse, rented condominium, watching the stock ticker of his former company soar under new, progressive leadership, while his own name remained a toxic, untouchable liability in every boardroom in America. True power does not merely punish, it rebuilds. Vengeance is a temporary satisfaction, but systemic reform is an enduring legacy. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, the corporate architecture of Horizon Airlines was entirely dismantled and reconstructed. The board passed the Washington Protocol, a sweeping, industry-defining anti-discrimination mandate. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executive vice presidents, was required to wear active body cameras during passenger interactions. A third-party civil rights auditing firm was granted permanent, unfettered access to all corporate communications and downgrade statistics. The zero-tolerance policy was absolute. Bias was no longer a customer service issue. It was an immediate, unappealable termination event. Within 18 months, discrimination complaints across the entire Horizon network plummeted by 89%. The airline's stock, which had briefly dipped during the initial scandal, rebounded to historic highs. The market rewarded transparency. The culture shifted. The invisible walls began to crumble. 2 years to the day after Flight 402, the terminal at JFK hummed with the familiar, frantic energy of morning departures. Isaiah Washington stood near the expansive glass windows of Gate 42. He wore a simple, beautifully tailored charcoal sweater, his hands resting easily in his pockets. The faint silver scar above his right eyebrow was the only physical remnant of the violence. He watched the massive Boeing 777 being prepped on the tarmac. He turned toward the boarding podium. A young man was standing 10 feet away from the priority lane, clutching a thin, faux leather briefcase against his chest. He looked to be in his early 20s, his skin the color of polished mahogany. He wore an ill-fitting suit, the sleeves slightly too long, the collar stiff and uncomfortable. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He kept looking at his digital boarding pass, then up at the first-class sign, then back at his phone, paralyzing hesitation rolling off him in waves. Isaiah recognized the posture intimately. It was the physical manifestation of imposter syndrome, the heavy inherited burden of being told by the world that you do not belong in the spaces designated for excellence. Isaiah closed the distance between them, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. "The gate agent is waiting," Isaiah said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. The young man jumped slightly, startled. He looked at Isaiah, his eyes wide. I think there's a mistake on my ticket. The university booked it for me. I'm flying out for a residency interview at UCLA Medical Center. They put me in row 2, first class. I've never even been on a plane before." The young man swallowed hard, looking toward the velvet ropes. "I don't look like I belong over there. I don't want to cause a problem. Maybe I should just ask them to move me to the back." The architecture of justice requires a foundation of truth, but the architecture of hope requires a foundation of grace. "You belong exactly where your hard work has placed you," Isaiah said gently. "Do not ever ask for permission to occupy the space you have earned. The world will try to shrink you. Do not do the work for them." The young man blinked, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "Thank you, sir. I'm Marcus, by the way. It is an honor to meet you, Dr. Marcus. My name is Isaiah." The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. The first-class cabin was called. Isaiah pulled his own digital boarding pass from his pocket. He looked at the screen. Seat 2A, the exact same seat he had bled for 2 years prior. He looked at the young medical student who was still gathering his courage to approach the desk. "Marcus, what is your seat assignment?" "Row 4, seat 4C. "I prefer the aisle," Isaiah said smoothly, extending his phone. "And row 2 offers a much better environment for reviewing medical charts. Would you do me the favor of trading seats?" Marcus looked at the boarding pass, stunned. "Sir, I can't take your seat. That's right up front. We rise not by the spaces we claim, but by the spaces we yield." Isaiah placed his boarding pass directly into the young man's hand. "Go ace your interview, and when you are the chief of surgery, make sure you leave the door open for the next kid standing nervously at the gate." Isaiah turned away before the young man could protest, walking past the velvet ropes and handing his newly acquired economy ticket to the gate agent. The agent scanned it without a second glance, offering a warm, professional smile. He walked down the steep, enclosed jet bridge. The air smelled of industrial carpet cleaner. He stepped through the heavy metal door of the aircraft, bypassing the plush leather seats and warm amber lighting of the first-class cabin entirely. He walked past row 2, leaving the wide, luxurious seat empty for the terrified medical student. He moved deep into the main cabin, finding seat 4C. It was narrow. The legroom was non-existent. The fabric was rough. He sat down, stowing his duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him. He buckled the thin nylon belt across his waist. The engine spooled up, a deep, resonant roar vibrating through the floorboards. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, turning slowly toward the runway. Isaiah leaned his head back against the seat, feeling the immense kinetic power of the machine lifting off the tarmac, tearing through the overcast sky, and climbing toward the blinding light resting above the clouds. True power does not posture. It sits quietly in the back of the plane, absolutely certain of its own altitude, watching the next generation take the sky.